So here we go. This is where we left off. We're going to talk about skeletal muscle actions. And so when we look at a muscle, okay, any muscle, so let's consider the biceps brachii. We know by looking at the name of it that it probably has two portions, two heads. And so we can see that there is a short head and a long head to the biceps brachii. And when we look at what the biceps brachii does, it flexes our arm. So it flexes the arm at the elbow joint. And if you recall from our last conversation, to flex means to decrease the angle between two bones. And so looking at the biceps brachii, okay, any skeletal muscle that we are going to consider, it is always going to have at least one origin. Okay, so it's going to have an origin or more than one origin. The origin is defined as the immovable end. And so in the biceps brachii, there are two ends to this muscle. Here's one end and here's the other. So the origin of the biceps brachii is at this end because this is the end that does not move. And in this particular case, since there are two heads, it actually has two different origins. One of the heads originates at the coracoid process of the scapula, and the other head, this long head, originates at the supraglenoid tubercle, which is superior to the glenoid fossa on the scapula. So that's the origin of the biceps brachii. The insertion is the movable end. So if you look at the other end, this muscle is attached to a tendon, which is then attached to the radial tuberosity of the radius. And so this is the movable end because when this muscle, when the biceps brachii contracts or shortens, it is going to pull on this movable end. It's going to pull on the insertion, and that is going to cause the lower arm to move, thus allowing us to flex at our elbow joint. Okay. All right, so that's the origin and the insertion of muscles. Every muscle will have at least one or more origins and an insertion. All right, the prime mover. So when a muscle is working, it is obviously going to either contract, shorten, or extend, lengthen. And so it is going to allow for some particular motion. The prime mover is known as the agonist, and this is a muscle that is primarily responsible for doing some particular motion. So if I am flexing my elbow, okay, if I'm doing arm flexion, flexing my elbow, then the prime mover is the muscle that is causing that motion, okay? And so in this particular case, the prime mover for flexing my elbow is going to be the biceps brachii because it has to contract to allow for that motion to occur, okay, to allow for the flexion process. Now, for every motion that we're going to refer to, such as the flexing of our elbow, there is another muscle that has to relax in order to allow that to occur. And we call that muscle the antagonist. And so when a prime mover is working, okay, when an agonist is working, that agonist being the biceps brachii, it has to shorten. There is another opposite muscle, okay, that is doing the opposite action. It has to actually relax to allow the prime mover to contract. And so if I am flexing my elbow, my prime mover is my biceps brachii that has to shorten. But then on the back of the arm, we have the triceps brachii, and that is my antagonistic muscle that has to relax in order to allow the biceps brachii to shorten or contract. And so the antagonistic muscle is resisting the prime mover's action. Okay, it's causing motion in the opposite direction. It is relaxing when the biceps brachii is contracting. All right, so those are, for every action, you've got these pairs of muscles. You've got the agonist doing the primary motion. We call it the prime mover. And then we have the antagonist, which is doing the opposite motion to allow that particular action to occur. Okay. All right. So we'll look at a couple of different types of actions and kind of go over the agonist-antagonist pairing in a second. There's another muscle type, and those are called the synergist. And so synergists are not ones that are primarily responsible for that particular motion. Whenever we have an action, there are often many, many muscles that are working to perform that action. If we're smiling, if we're lifting a fork to our mouth, we've got muscles that work in groups. There are probably about 25 muscles that are responsible for the smiling process. And so many of these muscles are, they're assisting the prime mover. They are synergists. They help to, when we're walking, there are muscles that help to stabilize our joints so that we don't lose our balance, so that's not all wobbly when we get up and stand. And so these, sometimes they fixate, or they cause, fixation upon that joint. They stabilize the joint. They sometimes add additional force to kind of smooth out the action of the prime mover. And so we call these types of supporting muscles synergists. Okay, they are there to aid the prime mover. All right, so here is what we talked about with the muscle agonist-antagonist pairing. So if I am flexing at my elbow, the biceps brachii is the prime mover. It has to contract to allow that flexion to occur. But in the process of doing elbow flexion, the antagonist, the triceps brachii, has to relax. Okay, and so during elbow flexion, that's this pairing. When I am flexed, so I've done my, dumbbell curl, right? And so if I want to bring the dumbbells down, I am doing an elbow extension. I'm increasing the angle between these bones, right? And so by doing an elbow extension, you've got another pairing at work. In order to allow that extension to occur, the triceps brachii is now the prime mover, because the triceps brachii has to contract to pull this out, the lower arm down, my lower limbs down. And so this is my prime mover or agonist. And in the process of elbow extension, the biceps has to relax. So the biceps now becomes the antagonist. Okay, so you've got these pairings that are at work. You've got muscle pairs. One muscle does the primary motion. Okay, we call it the prime mover or the agonist. And then the other muscle is doing it's counteracting the action of the prime mover. It's doing the opposite motion. Here's another example of a pairing. So when we are walking or running, you've got knee extension and knee flexion. So when we are flexing at our knee joint, right, you've got your hamstrings contracting. The hamstrings are these back muscles. They're called the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and biceps femoris. Okay, so we've got these three muscles that are collectively called the hamstrings, and they contract to flex to bring my knee up, okay, to bring the lower leg up. And if I want to do knee extension, okay, or extend my leg, then the hamstrings now have to relax. Okay, so they now become the antagonist muscles, and then the quadriceps muscles, which are my rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, and vastus intermedius. So 4 muscles that we call our quadriceps femoris muscles. They become the prime movers, and they contract to extend my leg, the lower leg. Okay, so we call this knee extension. And then when we bend our leg, we call that knee flexion. When we are flexing at our spine, we're using our abdominal muscles. When we extend, we use our back muscles. And so this flexion and extension also requires muscle pairs. All right, so here are some of the examples that we talked about. And so these are just some examples of the many types of pairings that we have. If you are in anatomical position and you flex your fingers, okay, we have muscles that flex our fingers. And if we want to open up our hand again, we have muscles that extend our digits, okay? And so there's another example. All right, muscle fiber arrangements. We have about 600 plus skeletal muscles in the human body. And if we look at some of the ones that we're really familiar with, like the pectoralis major muscles, okay? So here is an illustration of the pectoralis major, and it has a particular muscle fiber pattern or arrangement. And we call that pattern the convergent or triangular pattern because all of these muscle fibers that make up that muscle converges at one point. So it converges, it attaches to a tendon, which then attaches to a bone structure. And so this convergent pattern maximizes the contractile force of all of these fibers because they all converge at one point. And so that allows muscles like the pectoralis major, the deltoid muscle, which is also going to have this pattern, to be very strong muscles. Okay, so they are very strong in their ability to allow their fibers to contract. Another type of fiber arrangement are these long strap-like muscles. They're spindle shaped, right? So they kind of have these tapered ends, long strap-like. And so we call those parallel or fusiform. And so these are good not for power and maximum contractile force, but they're good for endurance. And so we have those in our arm muscles, in our leg muscles. So in the biceps brachii, we have what is called a fusiform because it's kind of like the parallel, but it has, it's bifurcated. Another type of fiber arrangement is called the pinnate. Pinnate fiber arrangements may have one unit, or it may have multiple units. And so if you have, think of the pinnate as being like a leaf. In fact, when you look at a leaf, okay, off of a tree, a leaf, you can see that sometimes it's called a pinnate, leaf. So a unipinnate muscle fiber arrangement is like half of the leaf. Okay, so one side of that leaf. A bipinnate is a leaf that has two sides, right? And then you might have multipinnate. And obviously, the more units you have, the more force that particular arrangement will have, because now you have more muscle fibers per unit. And so this is going to offer, more contractile force than say a unipinnate or a bipinnate. Let's see, here's another one, circular fiber arrangements. And so those are pretty obvious. Circular fiber arrangements will encircle an opening, a body opening, such as the mouth, such as our eyes. And so they are going to control sphincters. They form these muscular contractile units that are found in our openings. So they're often called sphincters, okay? And we'll talk about sphincters as we look at the muscular system, as we get into places where we have more sphincters, such as the digestive system. And so because they are circular, they often have the name orbicularis. And so orbicularis oculi is a circular muscle that encircles our eyes. Orbicularis oris encircles the mouth. All right, so here are some of the places where you find these various muscle fiber arrangements. So not all of our skeletal muscles are alike in terms of how fast they're able to contract, how tired they get. Do they get tired quickly? Do they get tired, are they fatigue resistant? And so not all fibers are alike in terms of these types of contractile activities. It turns out that we have some control over this. We can actually train our muscles to be more efficient at one particular type of activity. So we know this when, when we look at, say, professional bodybuilders or professional marathon runners, right? They've actually gone through a lot of training to allow their muscles to be more efficient at that particular activity that they are training for. But in general, our muscle types, they belong in these two basic categories. So at two ends of the spectrum, you've got slow twitch fibers, and then you've got fast twitch fibers. Okay, so we'll talk about these fibers. And then we do have intermediate fibers. So, they share characteristics of both slow and fast twitch. And so we call them intermediate fibers. But to make sense of it, let's look at the two ends, right? The two extremes of this spectrum. So slow twitch fibers are exactly what they sound like. They are fibers that contract very slowly. Okay, they contract very slowly, but that means that they're able to contract steadily. And as a result, they don't tire very quickly. Okay, so these are good for endurance type of activities because they are fatigue resistant. But because they are fatigue resistant, they're good for endurance. They're not really good for power. Okay, they can't generate a lot of force, but they can just, contract steadily for a long time. And so we find slow twitch fibers in our postural muscles, right? Muscles that allow us to, sit upright all day long, to be able to just kind of maintain our posture, maintain our equilibrium, and so on, hold our neck up, and so on. One of the characteristics about slow twitch fibers is that they have a lot of myoglobin. Okay, so myoglobin is like hemoglobin, but it's only found in muscle tissue. And so if you recall, the word myo means muscle. It's one of the prefixes for muscle, and globin. So this is a protein found in our muscle fibers, in our muscle cells, and its job is to grab onto oxygen. Okay, it binds oxygen. And just like hemoglobin, when myoglobin binds oxygen, it turns red. We talked about this when we were talking about the fact that along our superficial capillaries, we have a lot of hemoglobin. And when we blush, right, the hemoglobin binding onto oxygen, it turns red. And so that, reddish hue comes through as being, a blushing phenomenon. And so myoglobin, because there's so much of it in slow twitch muscle fibers, it causes the muscle fibers to be a little reddish, a little darker in color. Okay, so that's the presence of myoglobin. It causes a specific characteristic in our slow twitch fibers. It actually causes a color change. Okay, so darker muscles, redder muscles. Another thing that slow twitch fibers have a lot of is a lot of mitochondria. And this makes sense because if it's going to contract for a long period of time very steadily, it needs a good supply of oxygen, right? Which is where the myoglobin comes in, delivering oxygen. And it also needs a good supply of mitochondria generating ATP. Because these fibers are not powerful fibers, they don't have a lot of contractile force, they tend to be smaller in diameter. Okay, these are not large muscle fibers. And because there's a lot of oxygen, a lot of myoglobin, they rely on these slow twitch fibers rely on oxygen to generate ATP. Okay, so it needs a good supply of blood vessels going to that tissue to provide oxygen, to provide energy. All right, so that's our slow twitch at one end of the spectrum. These are also known as slow oxidative fibers. The word oxidative refers to the oxygen portion of their requirements. All right, at the other end, you have fast twitch fibers. Okay, these are known as fast glycolytic fibers. And these are called that because they contract very quickly, but as with any kind of, quick contractions, they are going to tire very easily. Okay, so these are not good for endurance, but that fast contractile force is going to generate a lot of power. Okay, so that fast frequency of contraction, fast frequency of contractions is going to generate a lot of power. Okay, and so these are good for power, but not good for endurance. Okay. So where do we find these? We find these in muscles that are going to allow us to say, hit a baseball, right? Hit a home run, or lift weights, or lift any heavy object, or so those type of things that are really fast in nature. So believe it or not, our eyes, right? So the movement of our eyes, that requires fast twitch fibers. All right, some characteristics about fast twitch fibers is that they have very little myoglobin. Okay, they actually don't require a lot of blood vessels delivering oxygen to those tissues. They have very few mitochondria producing ATP. So you must be thinking, where are they getting their energy to do this, fast twitch action? They're actually getting it from a process called glycolysis. So glycolysis is a cellular metabolic reaction that generates ATP, but it does have some disadvantages, and one of the major disadvantages is that it produces lactic acid. Okay, it doesn't produce a lot of ATPs for a long time, and so that explains why these are not good for endurance activities. And it also generates as a byproduct lactic acid, which causes fatigue in muscles. Okay, and so fast twitch fibers, you have to rest your muscle because they generate power, but they tire very quickly. Fast twitch fibers can get very large in their diameter. Okay. And so when we look at the types of things that might cause our muscles to be more efficient at one type of activity or another type of activity, we can consider different activities. Like, for example, if you're a marathon runner, okay, you are interested in allowing your muscles to be able to contract for steadily for hours, right, to finish that marathon. And so marathon runners are going to rely on what kind of muscle fibers? They're going to rely on slow twitch fibers. And so as marathon runners are training for their marathon, they're going to make their muscles more efficient at being slow twitch fibers, okay, at being able to, to develop, a lot of vascularity and a lot of blood vessels and so on. If you are a bodybuilder, you are going to do activities that train your muscles to be more efficient at being fast twitch. Okay. And what about, the rest of us, right? Couch potatoes, people who are not professional athletes. Well, we have these intermediate fibers, and then naturally our body, is more efficient at certain activities, and so postural muscles would be our would be a certain type of fiber, right? What kind of fiber would they be? What do you think? Fast or slow? They would be our slow twitch fibers. Okay. Whereas, if you're relying on, lifting heavy objects constantly, lifting your textbooks, you're relying on fast twitch fibers. All right, and here is the naming of our 600 plus skeletal muscles. And so we're not gonna learn all 600 muscles. I'll give you a list of some of the muscles that you're responsible for identifying when we get to the lab exam portion of this. But if you look at the names of these muscles, you can sometimes tell why, what that muscle looks like. And so when you look at, say, the deltoid muscle, okay, it is called that because the word deltoid came from the word delta, which is a triangle, right? And so the deltoid muscle being a triangular muscle fiber arrangement, okay, that name reflects the shape of the muscle. The trapezius muscle, okay, it looks like a trapezoid. Number of divisions or heads. This has to do with things that have multiple origins. So for example, the biceps brachii, the triceps brachii. Okay, looking at the name, you can tell that it's got multiple origins, multiple parts to it. Location. When you look at some of these muscle names, like we've got muscles that attach one rib to another rib. They're found in between our ribs, our two, if you look at two ribs, in between the two ribs, you've got muscles. Those are called intercostal muscles. Okay, so in between the ribs, intercostal muscles. We've got the pectoralis major muscles, the pectoralis minor muscles. The word pectoral means the chest area. We've got the gluteus maximus, okay, which is in the gluteal area, right? Attachment. This doesn't happen often, but in our neck area, we've got muscles that tell you where it attaches. You know, one part of the muscle will reflect the origin of that muscle, and the other part of the name reflects the insertion part of the muscle. So for example, the sternomastoid muscle or the sternohyoid muscle. So if you look at the name sternohyoid, sterno, the first part, is where the muscle originates, okay, the sternum, and hyoid is where that muscle inserts. How do I know which is which? Which is which? Well, the hyoid is the movable end, okay, it's the movable part, and so it always inserts at the movable end. All right, where am I? Size, okay, we alluded to this earlier. Pectoralis major is going to be bigger than the pectoralis minor. So when you have muscles that have the same, the same names because they're in the same area, sometimes you'll have a muscle that is bigger than another. Gluteus, we have the gluteus maximus, gluteus minimus, and a gluteus medius. So you can tell relatively which one is the bigger and which is the smallest. Orientation of fibers. When you look at the human body, there is a midline that divides the right side of the body from the left side. And so at that midline is where many of our abdominal muscles attach to. And so that midline is a connective tissue line. It's called the linea alba, the linea alba. So let me see if I can draw this. So this is the linea alba. Oops, sorry. Cannot draw a straight line. And so along the linea alba, you've got many abdominal muscles attached to this. Okay, they make up our abdominal muscles. So you've got the famous six-pack muscles, right? So the rectus abdominis, and they run parallel to the midline, okay, on both sides, right? So you've got rectus abdominis run parallel to the midline. So the word for straight or parallel is rectus. Okay, so that word rectus reflects the orientation of the fibers. There is another muscle in the abdominal area that runs, let me see where my pen is. It runs perpendicular. Sorry. This is so frustrating because sometimes I'll annotate and all of a sudden I will lose my, there we go. Okay. All right, I will lose the track of the pen completely, like I am now. All right, so when you look at these muscles, they run perpendicular. So here's the linea alba, and we mentioned that anything that ran parallel to the linea alba is rectus. And then we've got muscles that run perpendicular to the linea alba, okay? And the word for perpendicular is remember cross section, right? Going across. So we have muscles called the transverse abdominis. So it runs this way, perpendicular to the midline. And we have muscles that run diagonal to the midline. And the word for diagonal is oblique. And so some of you who work out, you may work out your obliques. So we have superficial external oblique, and then underneath the external oblique, we have internal obliques, right? And so we've got all of these various abdominal muscles. If you look at the name, it reflects the orientation of the fibers relative to that midline, that linea alba. All right, relative function. Okay, relative function. Look at the name of the muscle. Sometimes it'll tell you what it does. For example, if we are in anatomical position and I flex my fingers, if I do finger flexion, okay, which is to decrease the angle, okay, at these joints, right? There are muscles along my palm that allow me to flex. They're called flexor digitorum muscles. And if I open up my hand again, if I do hand extension, I've got muscles back here that do extension. They're called extensor digitorum muscles, right? So flexor digitorum allows me to flex, and then extensor digitorum allows me to extend my fingers. We've got this particular action where I mentioned last time, if you are in anatomical position and you take your palm and you turn it so that it's facing posteriorly, right, toward the back of your body, we call that process pronation. And so there's a muscle in our lower arm that is called the pronator teres. So the pronator teres allows me to pronate my forearm. And if I bring it back into anatomical position, do you remember what that action was called? It is called supination. And there's a muscle called the supinator muscle. And so the name tells you what it does. And so that is the function function piece of it. All right. Okay, last slide. I would encourage you guys to look at the name of the muscle, because oftentimes when you look at the name, it tells you what it does. If you have a muscle that's called the abductor digiti minimi, it is going to abduct. And remember, abduct is to pull the body structure away from the midline, right? So I'm abducting my finger, my digit. If I have an adductor muscle, okay, that muscle is going to bring the digit closer to the midline. Many of these words reflect, just Latin roots. And so if you understand the Latin root, it will help you to figure out what that muscle is. All right, here are some more mnemonic devices and some root words for you to be familiar with. All right, so we're done with the muscular system.